Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud while stoned. In this video, we are going to do part 4, and possibly the last part, of Little Blue Book number 141, titled The Reformation and the Protestant Response, written by Joseph McCabe, and it was copyright 1926. And it's been pretty cool so far, the history. It has given us quite a bit of the history of the popes surrounding this time period and why the Reformation was so necessary. So, here we go. We left off at the top of page 47. And here's where we pick up. This absolute and entire failure of the popes to effect any reform during centuries of corruption may seem, from a merely human point of view, natural enough, though it makes a mockery of the Catholic claim. But the sustained reluctance of the popes in face of the revolt of half of Christendom is amazing. The only possible explanation is that the Vatican was so steeped in evil ways that a reform from within was impossible. There was no reform, no counter-reformation or Catholic Reformation until England had followed the example of Germany. The Protestant doctrines had made rapid progress in Europe, and no man could say how much of the Pope's spiritual domains and sources of income would remain intact. It was a reformation from without, not from within. And the disgraceful state of the papal court as late as the 19th century shows what it was worth. And I'm pretty sure I read that little bit before, but that was the end of where it was. Anyhow, I interrupted the sketch of the course of the Reformation at the year of 1521, and need say only for the purpose of this chapter that from that time onward it became a very grave and increasing menace to the popes. Secular rulers turning the page. Secular rulers plainly informed the Vatican that unless there was a moral and fiscal reform, it was impossible to check the rising anger which was so readily converted into heresy. The Elector of Saxony had already 3 times foiled Pope Leo's attempts to get Luther. Heresy was in danger of acquiring the one source of strength that would make it formidable, the support of princes. The German Emperor Charles was, though no model of chastity, an orthodox believer. But we do not need a prolonged search to find the usual very human elements in any spiritual triumph of Leo X. The emperor was embarking upon a serious campaign against France, and he wanted and received a promise of papal support. So he branded Luther a heretic, and Leo felt that he could now force the Elector of Saxony to surrender Luther to the mercies of the Inquisition. But Leo himself died before the end of the year, and he was succeeded by Hadrian VI. Quite certainly Hadrian wanted reform, and there were many clerics in Rome who saw that reform was urgently needed to save the papacy. But the luxurious and vicious cardinals appointed by Leo and his predecessors ruled the palace, and they smiled at the piety of his son of the working class, who had strangely found his way among them. Hadrian himself, in fact, did not propose to do more than modify the abominable traffic in spiritual things. He died utterly detracted within 2 years, and the papacy, again, fell to a member of the great Medici house. Clement VII was not vicious, but he was weak, and he was, like his predecessors, immersed in politics in the interest of his relatives. Catholic writers claim under his pontificate the first evidence that the Church could and would reform itself, and even so cautious an historian as Professor Robinson says, that the legate Campeggio, acting on the Pope's instructions, met the long-standing and general demand for reform without a revolution in doctrines or institutions. The truth is that the Catholic princes themselves, whom Campeggio was to combine in a league against Luther's supporters, compelled the Pope to make some show of reform, and what was done was of the most meager description. The pontificate of Clement the 12th, Clement the 7th, sorry. The pontificate, jeez, I can't even say the word. The pontificate of Clement the 7th precisely shows the utter unwillingness or incapacity of the Church to reform itself. The Lutheran princes formed a powerful league to protect the heresy. In Switzerland, city after city officially adopted the rebellion. Gustav Vasa adopted Lutheranism in Sweden, and it made great progress in Denmark. And, most formidable of all, Henry VIII had severed his own state and church from the Vatican, and the reformers were making dangerous progress in France. The revolution was sweeping Europe. Yet this representative of the more luxurious, most terrible disaster that Pope had ever imagined spent his life in promoting the interest of his family by political intrigue, and at the most made a few tactical and entirely useless concessions to a local demand. But my thesis, that the Church was neither, turning the page, that the Church was neither willing nor able to reform itself, is even more clearly proved by the pontificate of Alexander VI. When the Medicean Pope Clement died in the year of 1534, the Reformation was almost established. The one hope now for the Vatican was that by a drastic purification of the morals of the higher clergy and a complete reform of its fiscal system, it might unite the Catholic princes in a zeal for the faith and win back a large body of the people. Most of the German princes held firm for the faith, and they waited only for a general council to reform the Church and settle points of doctrine before they set out to coerce the minority. There was still a possibility of at least confining the schism to the few countries or provinces on the fringe of Europe. In this solemn hour, the frivolous cardinals who met at Rome to elect a pope and cynically implored the light of the Holy Ghost chose Cardinal Alessandro Farnese to wear the tiara and control the destinies of the Church. A more stupid and irritating choice it would be difficult to imagine. Oof, don't hold back. He had been known in the Church for more than 20 years as the Petticoat Cardinal. No one in Europe was ignorant that he owed his high position to the fact that his 15-year-old sister, Julia Farnese, had been the mistress of Alexander VI, and that as a cardinal he had had a regular mistress, besides his occasional amours, who bore him 4 children in his cardinal palace. At his cardinal palace. Why did they fuck with it? At his cardinal palace. At the very time of his election, his son, Pier Luigi, and his daughter, Constanza, were well-known figures in Roman society, and instead of retiring into a decent obscurity, they came out boldly to enjoy the new wealth and prestige of their papa. 2 boy nephews also, one 17 and the other 14 years old, were at once promoted to the cardinalate. Oh God, I could do that all day. And enriched with lucrative ecclesiastical benefices beneficiaries. God, I can't say that word for some reason. And both of these cardinals became as immoral as the rest of the noble Farnese family. Bunch of immoral bastards. I admit that Paul III was, as Pope, a man of virtue. He was nearly 70 years old when he was elected. But, although there were assuredly now many cardinals who wanted reform, it is a miracle of stupidity that any did not. The very fact that Paul III was elected shows that the papal court, as a body, was still corrupt. Its attitude is quite clear. Paul III was reputed to be a very able diplomatist, and he was to meet the demands of Europe for reform with all the astuteness and words that he could command, yet yield not 1 inch except under severe pressure. And that is precisely what was done, even at the height of the storm in Europe. Paul announced that a general council would be held to reform the church and settle questions of doctrine. It was 3 years after his ascension when he fixed the date and place of the council, and as it was to be held in Italy under the control of his legates, even the Catholic monarchs would have nothing to do with it. Paul was determined not to yield, and he wasted another year, and then announced the council at Venezia, again in an Italian town, which both Catholic and Protestant princes refused to sanction. And under papal auspices, when Paul's 3 legates made a pompous entry into Venezia at the appointed time, they found only 5 bishops there, and they ignominiously, retired to Rome. Many historians believe that Paul had not the least desire to hold a council. I should say that he was certainly willing to hold a council in Italy, under his own control, but he had only the faintest hope of inducing even the Catholic monarchs to agree to it, and he relied entirely on his diplomatic ability to bring about a union of Catholic princes and then organize a massacre of Protestants on the largest scale. Meantime, he had a reform commission to work in the Vatican, and although he gave the reformed cardinals to understand that they must be prudent and moderate, they, in 1537, presented him with a very ugly document, a list of the reforms which the Church must make from within. It is enough to say that the document was shelved in the papal archives, where it remains today. One office of the Vatican establishment was selected for reform, and the discussion of this lasted 3 further years. It was not until 1540, nearly 20 years after Luther had burned the Pope's bull, that any reforms, a few minor reforms, were carried out. One instance will show the real value of these, however edifying they may seem in the schedule. One of the grave abuses was the priest obtained lucrative clerical positions far away from Rome, and then lived a luxurious life in Rome on the income. This scandal, at least, must end, said the reformed cardinals, and the Pope resigned himself to sacrifice 80 notorious offenders. They tearfully pointed out. In short, they all remained in Rome. It is of interest to the modern reader to know that the popes and cardinals were not the only offenders in the Church. It was, above all, the German emperor who pressed for the General Council, so that he might unite and pacify his distracted empire, and the French king, and many of the subsidiary German princes, felt that it was very much against their own interest to see the emperor recover his full power, priests and laymen. In other words, were equally lax in regard to a reform from within. All that Rome, apart from the minority of reformers, wanted was a council which should satisfy the emperor that the followers of Luther were formal heretics, and he might unsheathe the sword. But the emperor wanted a council at which the Lutherans would assist in a discussion of doctrine and thus afford some chance of a pacific settlement. For this, he knew reform of moral and finance was essential, and Rome preferred its traditional device of bloody suppression. In 1541, the Pope met the Emperor and was forced to act. We're going to pause right there for a hydration break. A council should be held as soon as possible at Trent in the Emperor's dominions. It is enough to say that when Paul's legates arrived there with the usual pomp, and after allowing 3 weeks for the gathering of the prelates, not a single bishop had come. Not one believed in the Pope's intentions. At that solemn hour of papal history, he was enriching his family and parading his illegitimate offspring. When the Emperor heard that the Pope had, with incredible levity, just given his granddaughter, daughter of his illegitimate daughter, 2 duchies of the Papal States as a dowry, he threatened to invade Rome and depose the libertine. These are undisputed historical facts. These are the prosy statements you will find in any history of the time. Instead of the Church, either popes, cardinals, or prelates, being willing and able to reform themselves, they evaded every attempt of the laity for 40 years. In fact, for 130 years, counting from the Council of Constance, to impose reform on them. When the Council of Trent was at last announced in 1545, there were only 2 bishops present when the Pope's legates arrived. The purpose of the Pope was notorious. At the very time when he announced his grand plan to reform, he issued new coins in Rome on which there was a naked figure of Ganymede watering the Farnese lily. Secretly, as we now know, Paul was sending funds to Germany for a war on the heretics, which would make the council superfluous. So, to the end of his life, he resisted reform and relied on the sword. His successor, Julius III, suspended the labors of the Council of Trent and proved even more frivolous than Paul. It was only when Protestantism was fully established that some measure of reform became inevitable, and the sale of indulgences in Spain to this day is a sufficient proof that it was based on policy, not principle. The Church was reformed where, and in so far as, compulsion existed. That is the end of chapter 4. I'm going to pause right there so that I can get a drink. Now, chapter 4 is titled Humanity Crucified for Christ. That sounds very ominous, doesn't it? So here we go, chapter 4, final chapter. Pretty sure it's a final chapter. Humanity Crucified for Christ. Each of my little blue books is devoted to a great general theme. Yet I try and trust to make the essay which each contains of some special value to the reader. Usually my task is to make clear the general principles of the subject and give only such detail as is strictly relevant and vital. I have done this as regards the first part of my thesis, that the Reformation was a religious movement, one of a number that had been initiated in Europe during the Middle Ages, and that it succeeded more than they because of the new conditions of the world. The next step was to show that such a revolution in the creed and religious institutions of Europe was necessary, because the Church was quite incapable of reforming itself. This had to be shown by a mass of historical detail in the last chapter. I showed that the 1 or 2 feeble popes in 150 years who wished to reform the Church could do nothing. The overwhelming majority wanted no interference with the life of the higher clergy at Rome, and empathetically no reason of the corrupt financial system of the Church, no reform of the corrupt financial system of the Church. The authority of the Pope had to be broken before there could be any reform. It was broken when Sixtus V and the famous Council at Trent at last effected some reforms, though the morals of even the higher clergy of Rome remained for 3 centuries far removed from the standard of propriety when the American visitor finds in Rome today. It remains to tell how Rome now failed to drown the new heresy in blood, as it had drowned previous revolts, and how, in its effect to do so, it crucified humanity anew. It may be said in a word that the new religion triumphed for the same reason that Christianity had triumphed in the 4th century. It won the favor of secular princes. The Protestant, who seeks a divine intervention in the affairs of the world in the 16th century, is almost as eccentric as the Catholic who holds that his church enjoyed a divine guidance throughout the nightmare of the early Middle Ages and the corruption of the later. Religious ideas prevailed, like political ideas, when the sword of the soldier enforced or protected them. A summary of the essential facts after 1521, where I left the story in the 3rd chapter, will suffice. Luther, branded a heretic by the emperor at the instigation of the papal legate, was in hiding in the Wartburg fortress. His great hymn, "Our God is a Strong Fort," is not without irony. The Wartburg and the soldiers of the Elector had to represent God to him for the time being. Well, that was a strange sentence. But here the zealous Protestant might discern the hand of God. The greed and ambition of the young emperor drove him to military fields abroad for several years, and the governing council which he left in Germany proved feeble and futile. The new ideas spread rapidly, and several men of power were won to them. The city of Wittenberg officially embraced some of the new ideas, modifying the Mass, establishing fasts, and pooling church property, and Luther was encouraged to return. The new Pope, Hadrian VI, wanted reform, as I said, but could not achieve it. Through his legate at the Diet of Nuremberg in 1523, he admitted the corruption of the Church, yet he demanded the enforcement of the edict against Luther. The Diet refused to prosecute, demanded a general council, and enjoined on Luther merely to refrain from further controversy until the council was held. One might as well tell a fire to burn no further. The Reformation swept on. To the Diet of Spires in 1524, the Pope sent his ablest legate, Campeggio, and promised reform. Now the Diet promised to enforce the coercive decree, but it was too late to do so, and the opposing forces secretly organized. The Pope's representative formed a Catholic League of the Duke of Austria, the 2 Dukes of Bavaria, and a few others, incidentally assigning to each, on the Pope's instructions, a large bribe out of church funds, and the Elector of Saxony, the Margrave of Hesse, and others formed a league to protect the reformers. The Swiss cities were now adopting the ideas of Zwingli, and an attempt was made to unite the German and Swiss reformers, but Luther and Zwingli, who met in 1529, could not agree. The Swiss cities combined separately to protect their reformed religion. In the same year, 1529, the Diet of Spires received orders from the emperor, who was still abroad, to enforce the Worms decree against the innovators. Here it was that the Lutheran minority of the Diet made the famous protest, which made them henceforth the Protesters, or Protestants. In 1530, I did not know that, in 1530 the Emperor Charles returned and the moment of crisis seemed to have arrived. He summoned a diet at Augsburg, inviting the Protestants to formulate their views, and they did so in the Augsburg Confessions. To this document, rejecting ocular confession, the Mass, clerical celibacy, and monastic vows, the majority replied by a decree that if the Protestants did not voluntarily submit by a certain date, the truth would be enforced upon them in the traditional way of those pious times. But the confession had the signatures of the Elector of Saxony, the Constantine of Protestantism, Philip of Hesse, the Margrave of Brandenburg, the Dukes of Lunenburg, and the representatives of various cities, and when they left the Diet and formed a Schmalkaldic. Yeah, this is Schmalkaldic League. The odor of gunpowder restrained the zeal of the Orthodox. The period of grace was extended. The emperor was busy with his personal ambitions, the Turks were threatening Christendom, and the Catholic princes were not too eager to see the emperor triumph. It is not for a very profane historian like myself to say if God arranged these things. Well, then don't say it. Meantime, as I said, Lutheranism conquered Denmark and Scandinavia, and the strange spectacle was seen in Paris in 1528, of His Most Catholic Majesty inviting the reformers to set forth their ideas in his palace, through the mouth of a zealous young man named Calvin, of whom the world would hear much. The king's sister favored the new ideas. Doesn't surprise me, rich people favoring Calvinism. The Sorbonne was deeply infected with them, but Calvin had to fly to Geneva, where he persuaded the Swiss to exchange the less irrational views of Zwingli for his own dreary and ferocious predestinationalism, which soon showed its human value in the horrible outrage of the burning of the brilliant young Spaniard Servetus, because his views of religion were 2 centuries more enlightened than those of John Calvin. Such a shame. Meantime, also, Henry VIII of England had been inspired by his lust and by the papal control of his appetites to reflect in his turn on the basis of the Pope's power. The superficial Catholic view, which represents the Reformation in England as merely an expression of the perversity of Henry VIII, ought to be resented by Catholic readers as an insult to their intelligence. Long before Henry's time, more than 1/10 of England had embraced the even more radical Protestantism of Wycliffe, and the grounds of that heresy remained. The actual teaching of Christ is the Gospels on the one hand, and the elaborate mythology and corrupt practices of the Church on the other. All Europe was ready for a reform, and was prevented from embracing it only by the use of force. Long before the question of Henry's divorce arose, the learned dean of St. Paul's Coit was preaching a kind of Protestantism and had many supporters. But, however, we may smile at the character of the man who, in 1533, displaced the Pope, the petticoat cardinal, as the head of the Church of England. We can quite easily see how he could reach his conclusion in sincerity. The English kings had long refused to recognize papal supremacy in the form in which the popes demanded a recognition of it, and royal advisers like Cranmer, who became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1532, had studied the Lutheran ideas at Cambridge and in Germany. To look for ambitions and lusts at the root of the English Reformation is to the modern mind amusing. The contrast of Christ's teachings and the teachings and practice of Rome was so glaring that, no matter what occasion demanded to reflect on it, he could hardly be other than sincere in saying that he perceived it. It is much easier to understand that a case in recent times of a Protestant English prince's discovering just when the Spanish royal crown was dangled before her eyes, that the mythology of the Spanish Church is much nearer to the teaching of Christ than the comparatively respectable tenets and practices of the Church of England. And every Catholic in the world warmly approved the conversion and subsequent marriage to the King of Spain of the English princess. Oh, Spain of that English princess. Whatever. You'd have to look up 1926 to understand what he's talking about, apparently. I need not, therefore, follow the details of the English Reformation. To most of us moderns, the only difficulty is to understand how it took men so long to realize the rottenness, the untruthfulness of the basis of the papal claim. For little beyond that was rejected in the early days of the Reformation. England remained Catholic, and the Bishop of Rome was told to confine himself to his own ill-regulated diocese. But the discovery of one papal fraud was bound to lead to the discovery of others, and presently the maggots were ejected from the comfort of the monastic cheese. The mummery of the Mass was seen to be a burlesque of Christ's Last Supper. The confessional was easily recognized as an invention of medieval priestcraft, and so on. Protestantism in every country ran its inevitable course. Luther died, and the Council of Trent began its labors in 1546. The schism was now a formal and powerful heresy, and Pope Paul III egged on the emperor and the Catholic princes to a crusade. Paul secretly promised the emperor 100,000 ducats out of the papal treasury, 12,000 soldiers in papal pay, and half a year of the revenue of the Spanish Church, and 500,000 ducats worth of monastic property, the confiscation of which in England so profoundly shocked the Pope. Charles was at length brought or driven to the conclusion of a secret treaty with the Pope and the Catholic princes to make war on his Protestants. Again he hesitated for a moment when he learned that the Pope, to precipitate matters, had treacherously betrayed this plot to the Protestants themselves and had invited other Catholic monarchs to join the crusade, and thus diminished the glory of the vain monarch. Charles inflicted some defeats on the Protestants, and then bitterly disappointed and angered the Pope by granting the interim a temporary peace and compromise between the two parties. The Treaty of Augsburg of 1555 then promised mutual toleration and liberty. But a new religious force, the Jesuits, now appeared, and the court of Rome was purified of its paganism, and the inevitable issue was war, monarchs, burnings, hangings, disembowelings. The civilization of Europe, which had begun to advance again, was once more put back 100 years. France checked its Protestants by the most horrible outrage that stains its chronicles, and the St. Bartholomew Massacre, 1572, over which the Pope sang a Te Deum, and by the war against the Huguenots, England stank with the burning flesh of martyrs on both sides. In the little Netherlands, Catholic Spain's butcher bill amounted to more than 100,000 men and women. Germany, or the whole central part of Europe, remained a charnel house for decades, Bohemia the main battlefield, and until then a most promising civilization, had its 30,000 prosperous villages reduced to 6,000, its 3 million enlightened citizens reduced to 780,000 beggars. The plague, supervening upon the impoverished people, carried off a further 100,000. So, the glorious Reformation and the now Reformed Church of Rome crucified humanity afresh. The same fierce intolerance remained on both sides. The human interests of man were despised on both sides. The new culture, which had initiated and symbolized the awakening of civilization, was dreaded by both sides. Protestantism had the lean fanatics' hatred of art. Catholicism prostituted it and ruined its inspiration. Eyes bloodshot with hatred glared across streets and frontiers at each other. You would tell me that God and Christ were looking down on all this new and unprecedented massacre and debauchement of men in their name. The only excuse for God is that he does not exist. But humanity had now germs of mental vitality in it which could never again be destroyed. Even in the religious field, Anabaptists and Socians appeared. Presently, deism would inaugurate the final development. Science found laboratories where popes and their inquisitors dare no longer intrude their noses. I am indisposed to welcome the Reformation, not indeed the narrow theology, the dreary worship, the ferocious orthodoxy, which some would perpetuate in the world. But the effect on Rome, it proved that the new tyranny of a book had no approach to the tyranny of the Pope. The race began to speculate. A good lesson in rebellion had been taught. The progress of the world consists in learning lessons of rebellion. The Catholic sneers at the Protestant Revolution. He gives us the measure of his own fealty. And that is the end of book number 1141, titled The Reformation and the Protestant Response, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. Thanks for listening, and join me in the next Little Blue Book.